Paper shredded. What is going on, you wonderfully unwell little evidence hunters? Turns out the fastest way to hide a crime against science is to file it in a drawer and wait 50 years for everyone involved to die of old age. Does not always work. Today, we are opening 4 cases that multiple institutions actively tried to suppress, minimize, or outright deny, ranging from a program that called its victims volunteers while giving them no actual choice, to a researcher whose first comment about his subjects should have immediately and completely disqualified him from the building. First case. Buckle in. In 1950, the United States Navy had a very specific, very classified question. The Cold War was accelerating, Soviet capabilities were expanding rapidly, and American military planners had become increasingly focused on one operational concern above the others. If an enemy nation released a biological weapon over a major American city, exactly how far would it spread, how many people would it reach, and how thoroughly would it penetrate the civilian population before anyone knew what was happening? Rather than build a theoretical model, run simulations, or perhaps consult someone with a functional ethical compass, the Navy decided to simply answer the question the direct way, by doing it. To a real city, full of real people, none of whom had been asked, informed, or made aware in any way that this was about to happen to them. The city was San Francisco, California. The operation was called Operation Sea Spray. The fact that this is not the most well-known government scandal in American history remains genuinely remarkable. Here is the setup. Between September 20th and September 27th of 1950, the Navy positioned a minesweeper called the USS Rodman just off the coast of San Francisco Bay and used it to spray a fine aerosol mist of Serratia marcescens bacteria across an estimated 117 square miles of the city below. Serratia marcescens, if you are not familiar, is a rod-shaped gram-negative organism that military researchers had formally classified as a harmless biological simulant, meaning it could stand in for a genuine lethal pathogen during dispersal testing without actually harming anyone in the process. The logic was clean enough on paper: track how far the bacteria traveled, measure how deeply it penetrated the civilian population, model what a real biological weapon would do to an urban area, then go home with your data and your clean hands. Simple, clean, contained. Well, almost. Within days of the operation concluding, a cluster of patients began arriving at Stanford University Hospital, presenting with severe and unusual urinary tract infections. The infections were caused by an organism that hospital staff did not typically see in that particular clinical context. That organism was Serratia marcescens. 11 patients were hospitalized in total. One of them, a cardiac surgery patient by the name of Edward Nevin, developed bacterial endocarditis as a direct complication of the infection and died. His family eventually sued the United States government for wrongful death. The government's position throughout the litigation was that the bacteria were classified as safe, the timing was purely coincidental, and the program was a necessary element of national security research that could not be compromised. The case was dismissed. The family received nothing. The program continued, and continued it did, without interruption. The Navy went on to conduct over 200 additional open-air biological tests on American cities over the following 20 years. Different cities, different bacterial strains, different civilian populations who had consented to nothing, signed nothing, and had no knowledge whatsoever that a government vessel was quietly misting their streets and transit systems with experimental microorganisms while they ate dinner. Bacteria used across different tests included Bacillus globigii and, in at least one documented case, zinc cadmium sulfide, a fluorescent particulate later found to be potentially carcinogenic, sprayed over residential neighborhoods. Several tests targeted airport terminals and commuter transit infrastructure specifically. One test involved releasing bacteria directly into the New York City subway system to observe how quickly it moved through ventilation shafts and concentrated pedestrian foot traffic. The results, apparently, were instructive enough to justify continuing the program for 2 more decades. Now, to be fair, and I am using that phrase with the full weight of irony behind it, the military's reasoning was not without a certain cold internal logic. Soviet biological weapon development was a genuine and documented strategic concern. The Cold War had generated enormous defense budgets and practically no ethical oversight infrastructure. The general institutional attitude toward human subjects in government-adjacent research during this period is best summarized as produce results, classify everything, ask as few questions as possible. So when a researcher proposed aerosolizing a major American coastal city with live bacteria to test dispersal patterns, the response from the chain of command was essentially, sounds workable. Which city? How soon? That guy walking up to me in the park with the government-issue spray canister. What The program stayed fully classified for nearly 3 decades. In 1977, the Senate subcommittee hearings into CIA and military misconduct accidentally surfaced Operation Sea Spray documentation, discovered by a staffer who had been searching for something else entirely, which is perhaps the most fitting origin story possible for a revelation of this nature. Congressional investigators described the documentation as evidence of a systematic program of covert human experimentation conducted by the United States military on its own civilian population over more than 2 full decades. By that point, the program's architects had retired. No charges were filed, no prosecutions followed. Edward Nevin's grandson, Edward Nevin III, testified before Congress that his grandfather had been killed by his own government without knowledge or consent, and that the family had received no acknowledgement, no apology, and no compensation in 27 years. The Navy formally maintained that Serratia marcescens was a safe simulant well into the mid-1970s, despite a documented civilian fatality sitting on record from 1950. What did the United States government actually learn from 2 decades of covertly releasing biological agents over its own civilian population? Mainly, that bacteria travel efficiently through urban environments, which was, to be clear, exactly the answer they were looking for. The science worked. The objectives were achieved. It just happened to require quietly converting the residents of San Francisco, New York, and several other American cities into uninformed test subjects, a methodological choice the relevant agencies apparently considered well within operational bounds. The documentation was formally declassified in the late 1990s. The Department of Defense confirmed the program's existence, confirmed it had involved the deliberate release of biological agents over American cities without public knowledge, and characterized the decision-making of that era as a product of its time. A product of its time. 200 open-air biological weapons tests conducted on American civilian populations over 20 years was, in the government's official framing, simply a product of its time. Right. The next case is set in a different country, a different government, considerably less restraint, and considerably fewer euphemisms. Guatemala, 1946. The Second World War had just ended. The Nuremberg trials were in full swing, actively prosecuting Nazi physicians for crimes against humanity. And the United States Public Health Service was, simultaneously and with complete federal funding, running a program in which it deliberately infected Guatemalan prisoners, soldiers, and psychiatric patients with active syphilis and gonorrhea without their knowledge or consent. The man in charge was Dr. John Cutler, a U.S. Public Health Service researcher officially tasked with studying penicillin's effectiveness against sexually transmitted infections. Legitimate enough at face value. The methodology, though, was the part that Dr. Cutler appears to have clearly understood would require a certain amount of institutional discretion, because the methodology involved locating human beings in positions of maximum vulnerability, giving them no information about what was being done to them, and infecting them with diseases. Well, that sounds like it could be defensible post-war medical science. Oh wait, no. These were prisoners, psychiatric patients, military conscripts, people in institutional settings with no ability to refuse, no legal recourse, and no awareness whatsoever that an American government researcher had any interest in their bodies at all. The U.S. Public Health Service selected Guatemala specifically because researchers could not have operated this way inside the United States. That is the whole point. That is not an oversight. Between 1946 and 1948, roughly 1,300 people were deliberately exposed to syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid through a range of escalating methods. Initial exposure attempts used infected sex workers brought into the prison facilities for the purpose. When that produced inconsistent infection rates, insufficient data yield, in the program's own clinical language, the researchers adjusted. Bacterial cultures were applied directly to the skin, genitals, and in documented cases, the eyes and foreheads of subjects. When surface exposure still failed to produce reliable infection, researchers cut small abrasions into the skin and inserted the bacterial material directly into the wound. Imagine being in a prison, having already lost most of your autonomy, and a doctor you have never met arrives with instruments and paperwork and an entirely unexplained interest in your skin. That is the situation these people were in every single week. One subject identified in program records as Berta was a psychiatric patient at the National Mental Health Hospital in Guatemala City. She arrived at the facility before the study began. She had not consented to participation. She could not have, as her psychiatric admission had already significantly compromised her legal and cognitive autonomy. She was inoculated with syphilis and developed acute symptoms. She was then inoculated with gonorrhea as a secondary compound infection. She died. The program's clinical notes document her case with detached precision across several pages of carefully formatted research data. The notes do not record any particular concern about her death. Cutler's own correspondence, recovered from archived University of Pittsburgh records decades after the program ended, described the Guatemala operation with what can only be characterized as professional excitement. He noted that the study gave American researchers access to a population of subjects that could not have been recruited domestically, and that the institutional conditions in Guatemala permitted a degree of experimental control that no U.S. facility could replicate. That is your red flag. That is the moment where you realize this man was describing the legal and social powerlessness of incarcerated foreign nationals as a research asset. He saw a captive population and called it an opportunity. The program was never disclosed. No participants were informed after the fact. No Guatemalan health authority was notified. The documentation was filed away. And it stayed filed away for 62 years. Not uncovered by a journalist, not surfaced by a whistleblower, not declassified through any formal government process. It was discovered in 2010 by a medical historian named Susan Reverby, who was researching the Tuskegee syphilis study for an unrelated academic project and found Guatemala buried in the same archived boxes. 62 years in a box, found by accident. When President Barack Obama called Guatemalan President Alvaro Colom in 2010 to formally acknowledge the experiments, he described them as clearly unethical. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Health Secretary Kathleen Sebelius issued a joint statement calling the events deeply regrettable. The Guatemalan government called for criminal prosecution. No charges were ever filed against anyone. Cutler himself had died in 2003, 7 years before the documentation that implicated him came to light, which is a convenient timeline if nothing else. Of the 1,300 people deliberately infected, fewer than 700 received any documented treatment. The survivors received no compensation from the United States government. So, did the penicillin research produce useful data? It did. Penicillin, as it turns out, is in fact quite effective against syphilis. Could that conclusion have been reached without deliberately infecting over 1,000 Guatemalan prisoners and psychiatric patients with active bacterial diseases without their knowledge or agreement? Almost certainly yes. Did that stop anyone from filing the documentation in a box for 62 years? No. No, it did not. Worth it, apparently. The Guatemala program did not exist in isolation. It was not an aberration. It was one thread in a considerably larger institutional fabric. Dr. John Cutler, the same man, the same agency, the same federal funding structure, was also a senior figure in the Tuskegee syphilis study, a 40-year program in which 399 black men in Macon County, Alabama, diagnosed with syphilis were deliberately denied treatment to allow researchers to document the disease's long-term progression without interference. This continued for 4 decades. It continued after penicillin became the established standard of care in 1947. It continued until a whistleblower named Peter Buxton leaked the program's existence to the press in 1972, 25 years after effective treatment had become freely available. Same researcher, same agency, different country, different victims. Identical institutional logic. That is not a coincidence. That is not poor judgment at the individual level. When the same government agency runs the same program on 2 separate vulnerable populations across 2 separate countries with the same funding model, the same institutional sign-offs, and the same absence of ethical review, you are not looking at a mistake made by one bad actor. You are looking at a policy. You are looking at an institution that had formally concluded, somewhere in its operating logic, that certain categories of human beings existed primarily as research material. Geography varied. Everything else was identical. Orchestrated final section structure with precise word targets and historical case selection. The same agency. The same funding structure. The same institutional conclusion about which categories of people constituted acceptable research material. The only variable across 40 years of the same program was the zip code of the victims. So here is a question worth sitting with before we move on to the final case. If an institution runs the same experiment on the same categories of vulnerable people for 4 straight decades, spanning 2 continents, 2 administrations, and multiple Surgeon General appointments, at what point does calling it a mistake stop being accurate? And at what point does it simply become a description of how the institution worked? Take your time with that one. Cincinnati, Ohio, 1960. The University of Cincinnati's Department of Radiology had just entered into a funding arrangement with the Pentagon's Defense Atomic Support Agency. The stated purpose of the arrangement was straightforward. Researchers would study the effects of high-dose whole-body radiation on human subjects, and the military would receive the data to help understand how soldiers might perform after exposure to nuclear fallout in a battlefield environment. Useful information for a government that had spent 15 years treating nuclear warfare as an operational eventuality. The lead researcher was Dr. Eugene Sanger, a radiologist at the university with an established institutional reputation, and what appears in hindsight to have been a remarkably flexible definition of the phrase therapeutic benefit. Between 1960 and 1971, 87 patients were enrolled in the Cincinnati radiation study. They were, as a demographic profile, overwhelmingly poor, overwhelmingly black, and overwhelmingly presenting with advanced or terminal cancer diagnoses at Cincinnati General Hospital. They were told, in the consent language available in documented cases, that they were receiving radiation treatment for their cancer. Several patients could not read the consent forms they signed. Some were not given consent forms at all. None were told that the primary purpose of the radiation doses they were receiving was to generate military data on acute radiation syndrome, that their bodies were, functionally, proxies for battlefield casualties that did not yet exist. The therapeutic framing was, to use the program's own internal correspondence, essentially a recruitment mechanism. The doses were not small. Patients received between 25 and 300 rads of whole-body radiation in single sessions. To establish a reference point, 300 rads of whole-body radiation delivered in a single dose produces severe acute radiation syndrome, nausea, vomiting, hemorrhage, immune collapse. At least 8 patients died within 60 days of receiving their radiation doses. Program documentation reviewed by investigators in the 1990s noted that some patients in the higher dose cohort experienced such rapid post-exposure deterioration that they were unable to participate in the cognitive and physical performance tests that constituted the study's primary military data collection. They were, in other words, too sick from the experiment to complete the experiment. This was logged as a methodological limitation. Dr. Sanger's own records describe the patient population with the kind of language that tends to follow researchers across history like a bad smell. Internal correspondence characterized the study subjects as patients of lower socioeconomic status with limited rehabilitation potential. A clinical formulation meaning, when translated out of the bureaucratic register in which it was written, that these were people whose deaths would generate fewer institutional complications than the deaths of patients with resources, advocates, or connections to anyone who might ask pointed questions afterward. That is your red flag. That is the quote you do not recover from professionally. He looked at a ward full of poor, sick, mostly black patients at a public hospital and filed them under limited rehabilitation potential. There it is. And the program was classified. Funding records were kept separately from patient records. The university's own institutional review infrastructure, such as it was in 1960, was not formally notified of the military's involvement in the study design. It continued for 11 years. It ended not because anyone at the Pentagon or the university decided it had crossed a line. It ended because a junior faculty member named Marion Spencer obtained internal program documents in 1971 and passed them to a local journalist. The resulting press coverage triggered a congressional inquiry. The university defended the program. Sanger maintained until his death in 2007 that the study had been conducted ethically, that patients had received genuine therapeutic benefit, and that the criticism directed at the program reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of the scientific context in which it operated. He was never criminally charged. In 1994, President Clinton's Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments conducted a comprehensive federal review of Cold War-era radiation studies, including Cincinnati. The committee's findings confirmed that the patients had not been adequately informed of the study's military purpose, that consent procedures were insufficient, and that the doses administered to the higher exposure cohort were unlikely to have provided meaningful therapeutic benefit to patients with the diagnoses involved. The committee characterized the program as a serious breach of research ethics. The families of deceased patients filed a wrongful death lawsuit. A settlement was reached in 1999. The university issued a formal apology. A memorial was built on the Cincinnati campus in 2004 to acknowledge the 87 people whose bodies had been used as radiation data for a military program they had never agreed to participate in. Sanger's name remained on the radiology building until 2019. It took 48 years after the program ended and 12 years after his death to take his name off the building. No criminal charges, no prosecution. A settlement, an apology, a memorial, and a building that kept his name on it for nearly 5 decades. That is the institutional metabolism for this kind of thing. Slow, reluctant, and calibrated to produce the minimum acknowledgement required to make the conversation stop. 4 programs, 4 governments and agencies. Thousands of people who were selected specifically because the people running the experiments had calculated that their powerlessness made them safe to use. That is the through line. Not rogue scientists, not isolated decisions. The same calculation, repeated, across different decades and different geographies, by different institutions that had all arrived at the same conclusion about which lives were expendable enough to be useful. Brush your teeth, and maybe read the consent form.